Right. Thank you again for joining us on a Saturday morning. This is part of the 2020 Community Forum, and today's focus, at least for the session this morning, we focused on youth civic engagement through COVID-19 and during GE2020, and really focusing on kind of like making the argument that there is an existing or growing divide between the government and ground efforts, and the extent to which that can potentially be bridged. And this will be built upon some research and work I've done during the COVID period and during GE 2020 using data from socialservice.sg. I'm Jin Yao. I am a PhD candidate at the University of California, Los Angeles. I've worked in the Department of Social Welfare. I'm really interested in working with adolescents and youth especially from low income and marginalized families. But another bucket which I'm really interested in is related to youth civic engagement and volunteerism, which kind of explains my interest in this particular topic. So that will really be the focus of today's discussion. Okay. So in terms of the sharing this morning, I've kind of divided it into three segments, right? So I'll first talk a little bit about youth civic engagement during the COVID-19 lockdown. So what were some of the forms of mobilization, action, and future orientation during the COVID-19 lockdown? Then talking a little bit more about youth political participation. So with COVID-19, the focus was on civic engagement, and then with G2020, really looking at youth political participation. And we'll talk a little bit about it. And of course, tying these two strands together, we'll be looking at the growing government ground youth divide. So how do we define the ground? How we define the divide? And what are some of the signs of divide between these two entities, and making a case for how it could potentially be bridged as well. So not just identifying the gaps, but also how it might potentially be bridged. And I'm probably going to take about 45 to 50 minutes, I estimate, and then we'll leave the remaining time for an open discussion, which will not be recorded. So a lot of it will be focused on, what you've heard, your experiences, and anything that might have come up, which may be of interest to you through the presentation and sharing, right? So let's move into the sharing first. So the sharing itself is kind of premised upon two podcast series that I worked on during the COVID-19 period, especially during the lockdown or the circuit breaker, and right after that period during the GE2020 in Singapore. The uniqueness of it was the podcast, at least for the COVID-19 Community Chronicles, it was focused on community initiatives that were coming up. And so questions I had for the participants on socialservice.sg were really about what were they motivated by, what were their interests, and what are some of the work they were doing, and also having an eye on what they were planning for the future. At the same time, we also kind of discussed structural and systemic issues that may have come up through their work and what they thought were issues that had to be addressed, or issues that they thought had gone under the radar that had to be addressed in that sense. And of course, these perspectives were gathered very much during the COVID-19 lockdown. So they weren't looking in retrospect, they were giving these interviews and conversations as they were doing their work during that period in time. And this is especially poignant for the 9 days. And it's called the 9 days because that's when, that's a 9-day period for the political campaign in Singapore. It couldn't go up to 55, 56 days technically under Parliament, under the Constitution, but it's never gone beyond 9 days for the past few decades. And so again, during the 9 days itself, we had conversations with experts, with individuals who were involved in different initiatives. But the focus for today's discussion, I'm really drawing data from conversations with young voters. So these were individuals who might have been voting for the first time. They were under the age of 30, and they were thinking about what the issues were coming up during the campaign and how they thought the campaign was going. And again, like the COVID Community Chronicles, the 9 days was really focused on, we really got the data during the 9 days itself. So they had no idea what the results were. I had no idea what the results were. So they weren't evaluating in retrospect. They were really thinking about the campaign as it was happening. So that's the uniqueness of these two podcasts. And we draw data from these two series for the sharing today. And I kind of organized it into three themes, right? So the first one, looking at youth civic engagement under COVID-19 lockdown. So as mentioned, we look at mobilization, forms of action, and how they were looking towards a post-pandemic Singapore in that sense. The second one, looking at youth civic and political participation during GE 2020. So in the context of a lockdown election or pandemic election, we're really considering how they were involved or how they were engaged during that period politically. And then tying these two strands together, looking at an argument that I hope to convince you that there is a growing divide between the government and ground in these initiatives, and how potentially the divide can be bridged in that sense. So let's first look at youth civic engagement under COVID-19 lockdown. So some background first. We look at COVID-19 as an interesting point of focus because we've known from existing literature that disasters like COVID-19 have adverse effects, but also have opportunities for civic engagement. So in the extant literature, they've documented instances after floods or natural disasters, populations, including youth, would come together in different forms of civic action and activities. And one of the most prominent examples would be Hurricane Katrina in the US. So, in the aftermath, people came together to provide help to one another. There were donations, there were forms of volunteerism and engagement to help one another who were affected by the hurricane. But the uniqueness, as we're all familiar with COVID-19, is that the disruption that's been caused by COVID-19 is quite unprecedented, right? So, not only are youths aware of problems, they're also personally experiencing some of these problems as well. Aside from this study, we were running a few kind of like engagement session with youth from low-income families, and we were documenting some of the problems or challenges they faced based on the domains of work, live, learn, and play. And so with work, some of them had to take up part-time work. Some of their family members might be involved in the front lines as essential workers, so that increases their risk of contracting the virus during the lockdown. And then in terms of living, if you're from a low income background or family, you're more likely to live. So in the past, you were already living in that circumstance, but if you had to negotiate living in the same space for 24/7, that increases to a certain extent psychological stress. And then in terms of learning, we know that home-based learning and its efficacy and efficiency really depends on your access to technology and whether you have the space to do so. So some of these challenges were personally experienced by many of the youths in Singapore and around the world. Another point of how civic engagement features here is that under lockdowns, even before the lockdown, before the pandemic, youths were already familiar with social media and internet. So they were very adept at using tools. So the likelihood of them using these digital tools under lockdown increases during the lockdown itself because they don't have the same degree of social interactions that they might have with their peers or friends. And so they're more likely to turn to social media. And through social media, they're also more likely to use it for different forms of participation and engagement civically. Right. So what do we really mean by youth civic engagement? Now, traditionally, we always think about civic engagement ostensibly in political terms. So whether you are aware of news, you're aware of these things, whether you are voting, whether you are involved in formal kind of political events. But it's also important to note that civic engagement also encompasses things like pro-social contributions. So things like informal helping, informal volunteerism. Are you helping someone in your neighborhood, a community? Are you helping someone in your family? So not just limited to political forms of contribution, which is why political participation is almost like a subset of civic engagement, right? And the reason why we're so interested and engaged or interested in the extent to which youth might be involved in forms of civic engagement is that how they contribute, we think, in the pandemic and during the lockdown is going to have implications for how they civically contribute in Singapore in the future. And we will see some of these examples in terms of when they articulate post-pandemic visions of what they think Singapore should be and how Singapore should look like after the pandemic is over. And in Singapore, the uniqueness here is we've been exposed. I shouldn't say we because I'm based in the US, where it's not we're not doing the best here. But youth in Singapore have been exposed to COVID-19 since January 2020. That's almost 2 months before the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a global pandemic. So what that means is that even though we had a lockdown only in April, youth in Singapore have had to deal with public health measures for a much longer period of time. During that period, they had to adjust to home-based learning. They experienced school closures. There were limitations to the number of people they could meet, and they might not be able to physically meet with friends as well. In terms of social media and the internet, we know that this is fairly well established that Singapore has one of the highest global internet penetration rates. So what that translates to is this propensity to use social media tools, digital tools to potentially engage in different forms. And then the final thing, which I like to talk about, often goes unnoticed because it's something we've taken for granted. But school-based volunteerism is compulsory in Singapore. It's been compulsory under CIP. It's evolved to be the VIA, which has less focus on it being mandatory. But there is this culture of at least volunteering in the school context and having some knowledge of how you might be able to contribute and how you might be able to be involved could inform potentially how youth could civically engage during the COVID-19 lockdown period. So that's in a nutshell the overall background and where we find ourselves in the Singaporean context. So I'm going to talk through kind of like the main findings, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through the findings and the individual themes here first, and then I'm going to show you examples, and I'm going to focus on themes 4 and 5 because I think those are the ones that have the greatest relevance to the government ground divide that we've been speaking about, right? So first, when we're looking at the first theme, which is the pandemic and lockdown as triggers, you had youths who were saying we should do something as soon as possible, as fast as possible. They adjusted not just the lockdown, but they were also looking at when DOSCON was raised from, I believe it's from yellow to orange in February. They were real fast to adjust to different measures. And then when the lockdown was announced in end March, there was a flurry of activity. They were taking quick actions in response to the speed of the lockdown that was announced, right? So that's the first theme in terms of the pandemic and lockdown as triggers. The motivations were a bit more straightforward. So one of the youth said, what used to be invisible is now really visible. And that translated into this visibility of community needs they saw on the ground. They saw that there's certain groups that maybe they have worked with before that required certain assistance and required certain needs. And the motivation here was to quickly do something in response. So seeing a need, I need to do something in response. And how did that happen? We kind of summarize it as forms of mobilization, action, and future orientation. So with online mobilization, because of the lockdown, the unique circumstance with the virus is that they couldn't mobilize in person. So everything took place on social media or online chat groups. There were two main forms of mobilization. The first group of youths, they already had an initiative, so they were thinking of how to pivot that online. The other group of youths were starting new initiatives at this point in time. The added dimension to this is not only do you have to think of initiatives and start initiatives, you also have to assemble your volunteer teams online. So you have to correspond to them, find communication platforms. Even those teams that were moving from an offline platform to an online platform had to learn, how do we do a survey? Should we use a Google spreadsheet? Should we do this? So there was this interrogation of how do we build this volunteer team and maintain this digital infrastructure that will support whatever programs and services that we were planning to do. And of course, they had to use social media and the internet for different initiatives that they were running at that point in time. And of course, this translated to action. So one of the youths mentioned this is about tweaking the platforms and building, quote unquote, our muscles. And the way they did it, unsurprisingly, was through direct programs and services. But they were also constantly evaluating and seeing how they can make changes to these programs that were done often very quickly. But what I thought was interesting here was not only did they have their individual initiatives, they were eventually moving towards collaboration. So recognizing that, it's great that I'm doing this, but what are the other initiatives out there that might be doing something similar or might not be doing something that we can potentially focus on? So from individual initiatives, moving to forms of collaboration, working across initiatives, having mutual aid sheets, having spreadsheets to coordinate requests and needs and ask. Right. And more importantly, the final stage of this with action was they were moving towards community building. So not just collaboration and working together, but actually creating coalitions through advocacy and activism. And this meant that they were asking questions like, why is it that my initiative exists? Is it because there's a pre-existing need that existed even before the pandemic that I had to plug? And that is beyond my initiative to fix this problem, this structural systemic issue that could be fixed by the government. And the second dimension to this is that they were yielding space to community members. They were saying, I'm not the arbiter of knowledge. I don't know everything. I don't know what the needs are. I need to use space and I need to understand from my community members what are the aspects that I need to pay attention to and tweak my initiatives such that they are relevant to what they're doing and what they need. So this progress from initiatives to collaboration and to community building. So that was the process for action. And of course, this informed the final part of it, which is future orientation. So not on the one hand, they articulated post-pandemic sustainable vision. So we're thinking about how long can my initiative last? Is this something that is needed after the pandemic? And if it's needed after the pandemic, should we do something offline? Should we go to the void deck? Should we do this? Should we go to community agencies? What is the role and what is the space that exists for my initiative after the pandemic? So we think about that. At the same time, they were framing their initiatives in relation to broader kind of structural and social economic challenges in Singapore, right? They were thinking about how does my initiative exist vis-a-vis certain government narratives? Is it that the government might not be doing something effectively? Is it something that I'm plugging that I might not be doing well enough and I had to fix? So that is the mindset of the approach they had in making use of the crisis to improve processes and structures for the future. So in looking at this, I'm going to show you some examples for each of these themes and then focus on the fourth and fifth theme for action and then future orientation. So with the pandemic and lockdown as triggers, so one of the respondents said, and this was in response to the announcement of the lockdown, he said, we are living in a period of very rapid transition and the environment just moves very quickly. We had to prototype something first, seek feedback, and then adapt just from there and see how it goes. So this approach of doing it as fast as possible. In fact, one of the other respondents said, "mai tu liao." So we have to quickly get something up and going because the pandemic is not going to wait for our responses. And then he adds, if something doesn't work out, maybe just throw it off very quickly and then shift to something new. So this responsiveness was a characteristic of the first theme. Then with the second theme, this is motivation. So this is a founder of a career advisory initiative. He was sharing that his team wanted to contribute without duplicating what had already existed. I'm just going to highlight the first part of this quote. So he said, we all have roles to play when a crisis hits. It's about figuring out where you can do the best kind of work, the best kind of contribution, and focusing on that and not trying to worry too much about everything that's going on and doing everything. So this idea that you yourself can't fix everything. So you find something that you're really good at, initiative that you can focus on, and then focusing on that, trusting that other initiatives will plug the gaps that have emerged because of the pandemic itself. So that's motivations. With online mobilization, this speaks to the speed and the way in which this was done. So a respondent said, as COVID-19 came along, the problems are the same, except made worse because we cannot visit the community. So this was an initiative that pivoted online. There were a lot of people who lost their jobs. So what we ended up doing was to quickly reorganize ourselves. And this is needs, ascertaining needs. We started doing a survey among the families that we know, and mainly from the parents of the children who attend our programs, and also the youth who take on leadership roles. So trying to understand what the community needs are before mobilizing online and bringing initiatives that were traditionally done face-to-face, which required physical interactions, to something that can be done online. And then with action, so one described the availability of muscles with more Singaporeans willing to help, who in turn needed more information and direction. So there were a lot of Singaporeans who were very well intentioned, but the problem here is that there are very few of us who have the correct information or have enough information to make good decisions about how to channel our donation money. So remember just now when I talked about moving from initiatives to collaboration to community building, this is a growing recognition that my initiative doesn't exist alone. It exists in an ecosystem where I need to understand, how do I help someone else understand these different initiatives? Is there ways to coordinate and collaborate so that they know these are the social services that individuals need, and then these are the needs that certain groups will probably need from the ground. So that's a form of action as well. And then I said that we're focusing on the action and future orientation part of it. And I think this is where it really crescendos into something fairly interesting and has implications for civic engagement beyond COVID-19 when it ends. Right. So we talked about how they were thinking about the long-term vision for their initiatives. They were thinking about, is my initiative going to be sustainable? They're thinking about, how do I connect my current efforts to longer-term efforts and longer-term visions? But, and this is a really big but, they were not speaking of their initiatives in isolation of the broader socio-economic context, right? So they're not saying, okay, my initiative, I'm only evaluating its sustainability because I want to see if my manpower can last, or whether we have the funding, we have the resources. More importantly, what they were saying is, are the socioeconomic conditions going to necessitate my initiative longer? And in the even longer term, is my initiative going to be something that can actually plug certain gaps that might be too broad or too immutable for me to do anything about? So one of them said, even with plans to make it sustainable, they are desiring to see more government action to make sure that these people are not vulnerable in the first place. So did my initiative need to exist in the first place? And we see this in this tension in the next kind of sub-theme. So youths were framing their initiatives in response or in relation to challenges and also to government narratives. So what there was consensus on, and there was no disagreement on, was that these different needs that were interconnected. Remember when we talked about low-income youths, the needs with work, live, learn, and play, they were all interconnected, and there were no disagreements that these needs had to be addressed together. But, and again, this is the second big but, respondents differed on the extent to which they thought structural problems were pervasive and how they framed their initiatives vis-a-vis government policies or narratives. So what does this mean? And I'm going to break it down because this is kind of like a pretty key kind of implication for the future. So this is the first group. So you had a group of respondents who were very involved on the ground. They saw their community needs and initiatives, the fact that I have to do something, as evidence that the government is not doing enough. And that really the reason why I'm doing these initiatives in the first place is that we need more radical or progressive structural and systemic changes to address policy gaps. So in the first place, the reason why my initiative existed right after COVID-19 was that Singaporeans shouldn't have been vulnerable in the first place. We shouldn't need these initiatives to come up to address these different needs and gaps, right? So one of them said, people have been facing financial and physical troubles since long before COVID-19 started. And arguably, if we had reached out to each other earlier to look after each other and to make sure that the government is looking after everybody equally, then we have been more resilient for this crisis. So this is the one hand, right? So this is individuals who believe that, hey, my initiative exists because there are systemic and structural issues that exist and needs to be addressed. On the other hand, respondents, and these are also people who are these are youths who are very active on the ground, they have their own initiatives. They actually say this, they say, we highlight the adequacy of government policies. They think that government policies are doing a pretty good job. And so actually my initiative is here to plug up certain gaps. So yes, the government has a really robust kind of safety net. And so my initiative is plugging up certain gaps and holes, not really big holes, but we're trying to see how we can support the government and kind of like support them in that regard. So one respondent would say they would describe government measures as being very robust. It's enough to support most in the population, but my initiative is just supporting a small group of part-time workers living in rental flats. So there really isn't much wrong with systemic or structural issues. It's just that, hey, the government cannot do everything. It's just certain policy gaps that I need to plug. And then another, along this tangent, acknowledge that government policies could be too complex and complicated. It's not the role of community groups or youth groups on the ground to address this. And he did not want to assume that it's easy to come up with social policy. So this idea that it's not my duty to talk about policies, I'm here to render important service to my community, and then I'll leave it to the government to come up with the social policy itself, right? So what is the implication of this? So the preliminary kind of discussion point is that youth engagement during COVID-19 is likely to frame how they contribute in the future and how they interact with the government. So the youth in the first group who rate the government's response as less favorable or who fault the government for not doing enough before the pandemic are more likely to be more skeptical and could potentially mobilize against it. I don't mean mobilize in the radical sense, but mobilize in saying that disagreeing with the agenda and being more proactive about challenging the agenda in the first place. On the other hand, and this is not something new during COVID-19, this has happened before COVID-19, and I'll talk about it later, youth who rate government policies more positively would be more willing to work with it. And so this gives the government an opportunity to co-opt these groups as part of its program. So it might, for instance, be willing to give more funding, to give more resources. And if it recognizes as these initiatives as being aligned with its agenda, it could also be more generous, for instance, with media coverage and it giving more coverage and ultimately folding it under its programs and services. So these kind of modalities are likely to, I think, be the main features in youth civic engagement after COVID-19, at least based on the data itself. And this has implications for, I think, the government ground divide that I will describe at the in the third part of this sharing, right? So at this point, we're going to take a short breather. Are there any kind of quick questions with regards to the youth sharing? We'll have a longer kind of open discussion towards the end, but are there any questions at this point in time? Feel free to put it on the chat or you can unmute yourself. Go ahead if you have any questions.
Hi, Jin Yao.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting that you thematically frame it, the use motivations as whether structure is the problem or not, right? The system is robust and why should we need to do this versus the system is actually quite okay and we just fill in minor gaps. And I was wondering whether this depends on the specific initiative that the youth do. For example, if let's say they work with migrant workers, then they will feel entirely frustrated because then the system is broken. But if they work with a part of the social delivery system that is more well developed and mature, then they might feel less frustrated. Did the people you talked to, was that part of the reason or was it in general?
I think that's a really good point. So the interesting thing is that the quotes that you see, the findings from at least from these two quotes, right? They are actually groups that don't work with migrant workers. They're actually both groups that work with low-income families in Singapore. So they actually work with the same group. Well, of course, the extent to which, and I'll talk about limitations later, the extent to which this can be generalized demands further research and investigation. But I think the type of issue, as you said, is likely going to be affected in terms of how they perceive government effectiveness or feelings in that sense. So what I guess a short answer to that is that my at least based on the empirical findings, I can impute my own interpretations, but at least from the findings, that's not something that I can comment on. Yeah. But I would imagine that yes, that the type of issue is likely to influence how you perceive the effectiveness of government and the extent to which structures should be improved or changed. Yeah. That's a great question. Any other questions? At least for this part, there'll be time for questions towards the end. So we'll build up towards that, hopefully. Right. Okay, I'm going to move on to the second part. So we talked about youth civic engagement under COVID-19 lockdown. The second part that came right after the lockdown was the election. And so we'll focus on political participation during and beyond Singapore's count 9-day pandemic election. So some background first, of course. Singapore, after Israel and South Korea, was one of the first few countries to hold elections under pandemic conditions and under lockdown. In fact, we had a long parliamentary discussion about, how do we make it safe for stay-home notices and those on stay-home notices and quarantine to vote in the election. And this second point is quite similar to what we talked about with youth civic engagement. 2 points that the lockdown together with the election is likely to increase social media usage. That's well established. And of course, that many of these youths are experiencing or seeing many of these problems firsthand. But maybe here I want to focus a little bit more about political participation. Broadly speaking, what we know from extant literature about political participation is that it can be broadly categorized as being conventional and unconventional, right? So what do we mean by conventional, unconventional, or traditional and non-traditional? The more conventional forms of participation usually relate to mass electoral politics, right? So revolving around elections. So this will involve you voting at the ballot box, you being a member of the party, you doing campaign work, you being a volunteer, you actually mooting policies that are directly relevant to the election itself. So those are conventional forms of politics. On the other hand, there's this increasing trend of looking at not just conventional politics, but also non-conventional forms of participation. So these are things like activism online through petitions, through letters, there are public protests, maybe not in the context of Singapore, but we've seen examples despite restrictions, and other forms of advocacy like civic engagement and social involvement. Now, the reason why there's this kind of two categories is for a long time, there was research on why is it that youth are less likely to vote. So you have this youth wave coming up, but rates of youth voting have gone down. Of course, not in Singapore because it's compulsory in Singapore, but around the world, especially in Europe and the US, there were questions as to why youth voting rates were going down. But what the other strand of research was saying that there was increasing disillusionment with conventional politics. So youths are starting to see that, if there was so much gridlock and so much problems with conventional politics, then they were turning to non-conventional forms to bring about change. So instead of looking at just the dropping in voting rate, which relates directly to conventional forms of participation, there were more calls for attention to non-conventional forms of engagement. And there's also agreement that, political participation is not just limited to conventional forms, especially with social media and the internet. Now, we can look at some examples. So one of the arguments that's been mooted as to why more youth turn to non-conventional politics is that they feel excluded from traditional political systems. It's dominated by older individuals, by people who might be perceived as being out of touch. There might be disenchantment about existing politics. This was most prominent in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 mass global recession in Europe, where there's been persistent high levels of youth unemployment. There's skepticism as to whether politics can actually make a difference in their quality of life. And so there's this argument here that they're turning more and more towards non-electoral or non-institutional forms of political participation. This broadly kind of categorized as grievance theory. So grievance theory basically articulates that individuals are involved in political action because they're really unhappy with a certain circumstance, and they turn to non-institutional, non-conventional youth participation because they have no faith in conventional forms of participation, right? Of course, there's no established consensus right yet in terms of the mechanisms, but this is a fairly new trend of research and something that we can put to bear on what we see in Singapore in the later slides, right? And then one quick note about social media usage. So in terms of social media usage, there are two strands I want to bring your attention to. The first strand here is how do you use social media? Now, Extant literature has very well documented that youth really use it to seek information and express political opinions, and they broadly categorize it to be information consumption. So they read about news, they get more information about parties, they get more information about what's happening, and then at the same time they also produce information. So on social media, not only do they read, but they also aggregate content, they leave a retweet, they comment on it, they have a certain reply or retort to it. That's one bucket. The other bucket that we also it's important to understand here is, thus far it's been kind of assumed that the more use social media, the more they were going to be politically active. So the argument here is that the direction moves in, the more social media you use, the more active you'll be politically. But of course, there is the potential for it to be the other way around, and it's been demonstrated around the world that it's not this direction. It could be the fact that those who are already politically active use social media more often. So it's not really social media that's driving political participation. It's just that those who are active are driving social media usage. What direction this moves, there's been mixed effects around the world, but I'm on the fence of thinking that it's going to be a combination of both. And we will also see that in the example of Singapore as well, that social media usage and political participation are kind of like interconnected in that sense, and they move in both directions. And then a quick note about Singapore before we dive into the findings. Significance of the election in Singapore is that we've had the highest turnout rate since the 97 election, despite having no physical rallies, which I think is pretty remarkable, especially if you have examined, it's not my area of expertise, but they have documented how the rallies are, boisterous, and it's really the hubbub of political activity, especially for the opposition. In Singapore, we also have a really, really short 9-day campaign. And in this instance, for this year, political parties really had no choice but to pivot online. They had no choice but to turn their campaigning activities online. So besides televised broadcasts, youths were able to respond to a lot of these programs that were happening on social media. They had Facebook chats, they had Twitter and Reddit, kind of like Ask Me Anything threads. And these were opportunities for youth to potentially respond. And then finally, even though the ruling party still won a parliamentary supermajority, it acknowledged, I think this was Law and Home Affairs Minister K. Shanmugam, would say that they needed to acknowledge that the party needed to better engage young voters. I mean, this is not my area of experience. So this is not a post-mortem of the general election. It's not PAP, VPAP. So that's a separate kind of forum. But our focus is really on how youth engage. And remember that when we collected this data, youth had no idea what the results were. So actually the extent to which people say, oh, we knew this was going to come, I would say it felt a bit different during the podcast and during the 9-day period as well, right? And so this is a summary of kind of like the findings, and I know it's a lot, but let me take you through this kind of diagram for your understanding itself. So what we've seen is a few things. So this is a 2-axis kind of diagram. So we're first looking at motivations, and we look at motivations as taking 2 forms. So they were either motivated to increase awareness and to be more active, or they were taking action. They were motivated to take direct action in different forms. And in terms of political participation, there was emphasis on different forms of participation, either between the elections or during the general election itself. And so they were not just describing the importance of voting during GE 2020, but also recognizing that the forms of participation between the elections was no less important. Okay, and so when it comes to awareness and activism, they were really involved in the consumption of content and the production of content. So regardless of whether it was between or during elections, they were consuming content and producing content, right? I know this looks like squiggle marks. I can't get my cursor up, so bear with me for a while. So with action, they were slightly different. So we'll take a look at passing this through and breaking this down a bit further also. I'm trying to get my mouse. All right, let me clear my screen. So as I mentioned, the 2 main forms of motivation were to be aware and active and to take action. So these were the 2 main forms. And with being aware and active, the main forms of involvement was information consumption and production, right? Between elections, they took action by corresponding with politicians or being involved in different civic or political events. So these were people who were organizing events. These were youth who were organizing events, or they were talking to the politicians more actively. During elections, the parallel to this is that they actually engaged the parliamentarians or to-be parliamentarians and candidates more actively, and some also volunteered for the political parties. And the kind of thought I want to leave you here with is, as we move to the details, is youths were emphasizing this importance of political participation beyond elections. They were looking at how do we get involved beyond this GE 2020. So if I was not involved before, how do I continue my participation? And it's likely going to be a mix of online, offline, and both conventional and non-conventional engagement. And we'll see instances of this. So as you see the next few slides, as I take you through the next few slides, bear in mind these two things. Number one, they're really emphasizing participation between elections. And number two, this mix of online, offline, and then conventional, non-conventional engagement that will likely continue for the next few years. Oops. Okay. So first, with awareness and activism. So one of the youths mentioned this was about revitalizing democracy, and the youth respondents really had interest in national issues. So they themselves wanted to be more aware and wanted to be active citizens, part of active citizenry. At the same time, they also wanted to get their peers and contemporaries on board as well. So not just me, myself, and I being more aware and active about what's going on politically, but also wanting to change perceptions of youth political apathy. So trying to show that youths are not apathetic, and actually it doesn't seem like they are. And I'll show you some examples later. For example, with Motivations, a respondent, she spoke to climate change as an issue for which she cared very strongly. And she said, but we started to realize that climate change affects many other issues, especially like the economy, jobs, even social well-being. And I think I started to see and started to care about other issues from that lens of climate justice and climate change. So being a lot more aware of national issues and wanting to be involved in those. With action, and this should sound familiar to you because remember when in the literature we talked about the direction, is it social media usage that leads to political participation, or is it the other way around? So the interesting point here was there was growing recognition that the types of conversations that youth were having in different social circles were very different. So they stressed this need to go beyond personal bubbles, quote unquote, and emphasize the importance of voting. So some examples, right? The youth would say, my interactions with my friends and talking about the issues is going to be substantively different from my conversations with my family members. And this time around, they had no choice because they were locked down with their family members. They had to have conversations with their family members. So they recognized that disconnect. The other one were folks who volunteer on the ground. They were recognizing that the discourse that were happening on social media about the minimum wage and all these things, or political diversity, were very different from those they were seeing on the ground. So these were folks who volunteer on the ground. They were saying that, you know, the issues that my social circles are interested in might not be the same issues that others are interested in. Now, this seems obvious, but that cognitive dissonance was what was generated through this experience of taking action. And the end goal here is really to recognize that ground movement should slowly coalesce into achieving certain systemic or political change, and to push for progress. And this happens for both sides of the aisle. So this is not just pushing for change in one direction, but we've had respondents from who had interest in both parties who said similar things as well. So not just in one direction or the other. So for instance, this respondent said, you know, while acknowledging the challenge of encouraging political involvement, this respondent described how to achieve change, this process of taking action. She said, the mindset that people have is that change only happens on the inside. If you really want change, you must join the civil service or join a corporation and rise to the top to make a change. But they forget their duty as an active citizen, be it writing to the parliamentarians, telling them if they can ask this question in parliament. And she said and concluded, you must be a bit more involved with your political leaders on social issues. So this involved corresponding with political leaders, asking them questions, making sure that they are aware of what's going on the ground and things that in which you might be interested. So this is a key kind of takeaway I talked about just now. There was consensus that voting is important. Conventional politics is no less important. We still have to vote. It's compulsory, yes, but the importance of the vote is that it can foster certain results that we want. However, there was this emphasis that civic and political participation were ongoing endeavors. In other words, participation had to be fostered between elections. And these are some of the quotes that were from the youth respondents. So one said, democracy and active citizenship are not just about the elections. Your vote does not just die after polling day. Learning about politics does not happen just during elections. And it's a mistake to think that elections or democracy are only a once in 5 years affair. So this recognition that we are going to be active, not just during this election, but we need to continue these forms of participation beyond GE 2020. And then, in a more elaborate example, this respondent said, over the decades, we've developed the kind of mentality that politics only really matters during election campaigns. We have this frenzy of political activity for 1 or 2 weeks, and then everyone goes back to what they were doing before. And a lot of the respondents, in fact, most of the respondents were fighting against this narrative that the things should not go back to normal or go back to business as usual in the past. So here are the kind of like a few discussion points that we can take from that. So the first is that how youth participated in non-conventional activities during around COVID-19 restrictions and during the pandemic election is likely to inform how they behave politically in the future, right? In Singapore, politics has really been dominated by a single party, and some of the visions in terms of achieving long-term change involves increased parliamentary diversity and heightened personal involvement. And I must kind of emphasize here again that this was articulated before the results were announced. So this was not, knowing in the aftermath what happened, what they wanted, but this was articulated even before they knew the results on the election day itself. Next 2 points is that political participation really intensified this time round, and there were a lot of youths who were saying, I feel so overwhelmed. Even though I feel like I'm in the know, there was so much information that was coming, and there was this surge in social political interest and issues, but they were really also emphasizing that this cannot be sustainable. It cannot be just be every 5 years, 9 days, I look through the manifestos, I try to study, I try to compare it. But they were starting to realize through the interviews that they have the potential to bring about change during and between elections. So being committed to consuming and producing information and taking action between elections and not just during certain elections. And that's going to carry over because those forms of political participation, I think, and it's a case I'll make in the next section, is going to complement the forms of civic engagement that we saw during COVID-19 lockdown. Yeah. Right, so again, we'll pause for about a few minutes if you have any immediate questions about the GE2020 part of it. Any questions? Again, you can type in the chat or you can unmute yourself. If you have any questions. I think you're a bit choppy. You want to try that again? I didn't quite catch that. Sorry.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
I was wondering about the was the data from your podcast series, and so these were youth activists or those that were highly involved in politics at that period of time?
Yeah, so these were folks this was a mix of people who were involved in certain activities, running their own initiatives, but were also kind of ordinary people, like regular people who I reached out to on Instagram as well. So they were not, so I mean, of course, they tend a bit more to be more politically active, but there were also a few who were not, really involved in it. And I was just asking them about their general opinion. Yeah. So yes, it's based on the podcast data. Yeah. And there's a question about the use and all the episodes are public, so they're actually on socialservice.sg. I think it's the first 2 links. I will share them and share the screen also at the end of the presentation. So if you go to socialservice.sg, there's going to be a link there as well, and I'll share them towards the end of the conversation. So there are actually 2 questions in the chat as well. I think they're great, and I think I might address some of this in the next section. So I'm not going to ignore them. I'm going to put them aside for now, and I'm going to come back to them, and hopefully you'll be convinced by the next few slides. So what I've done in these first 2 sections are largely based on the podcast data, and so they're more slightly more empirical. There are certain limitations which I speak to, but in this next section, in talking about the growing government-youth divide, this is more of me coming out with an argument. And actually, I drafted a piece for the Singapore Policy Journal, which will come up, I think, either today or tomorrow. And so this is something that I'm mooting an argument for about both civic engagement and political participation in a post-pandemic Singapore. And it will take about 10 more minutes, and then we can pivot to the open discussion. And hopefully that's when I'll answer some of the questions also. So what this really means, and this is where I start to moot a lot more of my personal kind of perspectives and arguments. There is a growing sense that the government is not the only channel through which change happens, right? So youths no longer wait passively to be consulted or heard. They are realizing that they actually have the autonomy and have the capacity to actually actively organize to elevate certain concerns on their own terms. And even if they do engage the government, they are not convinced that the government always holds all the answers. So they're also like that. What that means is that they're likely to be less deferential. So they're more likely to create their own platforms. They're more likely to articulate certain issues that they think the government is not highlighting. Okay. And we have some kind of initial clues to it. So this data is actually from the National Youth Survey in 2016. This shows that there's actually a fair amount of awareness and engagement amongst youths. And which is why I don't believe there's actually youth apathy. If there is, it's more lethargy, but youth in Singapore are actually fairly engaged and aware. So about 86 and 78% of youth in Singapore use internet and social media to get daily news information on current affairs. And that's quite a substantial proportion of people who do so. And in addition, about 65% of them are actually involved in at least one civic activity. The range of civic activities runs from volunteerism to causes in the environment, writing letters to the editor. So it varies. And it's probably also inflated by the fact that it's compulsory to volunteer in Singapore, in the schools at least. But I think that's a healthy sign that youth are actually more aware and engaged. So beyond the data I presented to you, there are signs that youth apathy is maybe kind of no longer a narrative that holds water as effectively or as tangibly as it used to in the past. And maybe the focus here should be, how do we pivot this awareness and engagement into different forms of action? So there were a few trends before COVID-19 and GE2020 with youth civic engagement and political participation. Now, the first is that there's always increased communication through social media and internet. Just as an observer myself, even before COVID-19 and the election, you had all these groups that were creating memes and content on Instagram and Facebook that were combining really important concepts about politics and parliament in very digestible format. So they are little tiles, and then you can swipe them, and then you can read them, you can share them, and they're very easy to understand. And a lot of the groups on the ground have mastered this art of creating this very effectively. And that's one of the trends that happened even before COVID-19. The second is there's this rise in issue-based advocacy. So of course, a lot of us talk about the green groups, but there are groups that are looking at sexual assault and sexual violence. There are groups that are looking at working with low-income youth and so on and so forth. And not only are they working in that dimension, they are also working in a more collaborative fashion. So coming together as coalitions. So most recently, we see with Party Liani, with Transformative Justice, they're looking at collectives where you come together. There's also the provision of mutual aid as well, such that a lot of the issues and causes remain in public consciousness for a much longer period of time. So the fact that they keep advocating and being active in these causes means that it's not going to fade out of public consciousness as it used to in the past. So the news cycle can be kind of elongated or extended for a longer period of time. And then the third thing, which was a trend before COVID-19 and GE2020, is that there really is increased cognizance of social economic inequality and racial inequality. The two main episodes I point to with racial inequality is the brownface saga. There's this awareness that there probably exists systemic racism in Singapore, and then more and more individuals and youth in particular are sharing personal experiences of maybe being denied employment or housing or renting opportunities because of their race. And with social economic inequality really started, I mean, it happened before that as well, but with Prof. Teo's book that took the public attention, and since then it's always remained in public consciousness. And Prof. Teo, Dr. Ng, they have always looked at the minimum income study. There are studies that are looking at homelessness in Singapore. So there's increased cognizance of these forms of inequalities in Singapore. So I made this point about there exists a divide in Singapore, and I'm hoping to convince you that 4 signs of divide exist between the government and ground. And by the ground, I really mean use on the ground through ground-up movements, ground-up initiatives, independently running these different programs. And I'm going to make the case to you that there are 4 signs of divide that exist between the government and the ground. The first is ideological and fundamental, right? There's this insistence, I believe, that the government argues for, that change can only happen within and through the system. That if you want to make a change or you want to do certain things, you have to go through the government system. But what youth, I think, are starting to recognize is that even before COVID-19 and GE2020, they're starting to work with more individuals. So before GE2020, they were working with nominated MPs who were more active on the social grounds. And not just nominated MPs, they were also working with MPs of the ruling party who are very sympathetic to particular causes, right? For instance, Mr. Louis Ng is really interested, for instance, in single parents and single mothers. So if that's a cause you identify with, then you are more likely to probably volunteer for him or work as a legislative assistant for him. And now with GE2020, there's a slate of opposition MPs with whom you could work. So it's not that the government is any less powerful, but that's not the only form in which you could potentially bring about change. And after GE 2020, I think more youths are starting to recognize that they can reach their ministers and parliamentarians directly. They can actually ask them questions. You saw that during the GE 2020 campaign when people had Instagram groups, they had Facebook pages, and you could ask questions directly. And many of the youths in our sample actually were emailing questions, asking them, what's your position on this? What's your position on that? And ultimately, you can also bring about change in the ballot box, right? So if you think that this is something that you fundamentally disagree with, you could, in the long term, bring about change at the ballot box, and change will not just happen through the government itself or the government of the day. And if it's the case, in the second point, if it's the case that change can happen at the ballot box, then the second sign of the divide is political, because this means that youths who are playing for the long game and things on climate change, for instance, you do not have to appeal to office holders per se. Your main audience is not political holders and office holders. Your long game is really other Singaporeans, because not only do you not have to align with parties, you don't have to align with the ruling party, with the opposition parties. What you should be doing is that you should be showing proof of popular support. You should be showing that, hey, this is a cause and issue that has mass appeal, and we have this group of individuals that have been volunteering us for such a long time. And in turn, you're not aligning yourself with parties, you're actually advocating and lobbying parties to take up your positions. So for instance, let's say I believe in the importance of a living wage, right? Not a minimum wage, but I believe in a living wage, because I think low-income labor is not good enough. So maybe then I can mobilize a group of individuals who are involved in these issues. We constantly advocate and be involved in it. And in the long term, we are taking these issues to the parties rather than wait for them to make a decision on this. And so that's I think, going to be even more significant in the coming years in the aftermath of GE 2020 and COVID-19. Substantively, I think this is probably the most obvious point. Youths are likely to be disappointed by the slow pace of policy change. And this is even though they understand things like trade-offs, that public opinion shifts take time. So some of these issues that I think are more prominent are things about mental health, climate change, and LGBTQ rights. They're not going to be pacified by individuals in power saying, we hear you, we understand. They're going to ask actually, hey, you say all these things, but where are the actual policies that make this happen, right? So they're not going to be pacified, I think, just by rhetoric and narratives. They're going to ask for a lot more than that. And the last thing is about representation. There's a lot of text here, but if I were to sum up representation in a nutshell, I would say this. It's the extent to which national or government activities usually engage the same group of youths. And in a simpler way of putting it, and I write this in the editorial as well, the less the government engages someone like me, who is Chinese, who comes from an elite school, who is researching, who is very involved in this, the better. Because I think there is this predilection for certain agencies and state agencies and the government to engage individuals like myself, right? So I go for national conversations, I go for conversations. I always have this running joke about how someone like me takes up a lot of space because I talk all the time, I'm very loud. But here are the questions: how representative are these engagement activities that the government is putting out? So for instance, how many of them come from disadvantaged backgrounds? How many of them are sexual or gender minorities? How many participants in government activities have already engaged in these activities for a long time? So these are the same group of youths that are engaging over and over again. And then finally, we have the youth conversations, we have SG Future, we have OSC. Beyond the final report, how do we know these rhetoric actually translated into change? So youths start to ask, hey, we participate in this, we have this report, it looks good, we know these insights were derived, but has this actually translated to change? Or is this something that is probably meant to pacify us? So these questions of representation and translation are likely to continue that divide as well, I think, in the next years. So what does this mean? This is my final 2 slides. So it sounds all doom and gloom, and this divide is going to persist. And in my argument, going to move a few things that I think what the government can do and what the ground youth organizations can pay attention to. So for the government, I think it's a bit more straightforward. I think it's learning to move beyond its comfort zone to engage youth who are increasingly diverse, not just in demographics, but also in terms of how they think and how they believe and perceive certain issues. They are more likely to challenge dominant narratives than to conform to what's existing out there. So for instance, there are going to be fewer sacred cows. For instance, we're going to question things like meritocracy. Is this something that really is we've used it, and I think to some extent it's been a great reason why Singapore has been successful. But there are going to be questions about, is this progressive enough? In meritocracy in the third generation, does this apply in the same way to Singapore's first generation? So these questions I think are going to come up over and over again. The second point that the government, I think, should recognize is that constructive discourse can happen outside its ambit. So it's okay that you have your own conversations and that people outside have their own conversations, right? That's fine because issues are complex. They're going to have diverse perspectives. It's fine that people have different conversations. Now, the question is, how do you, in a very non-condescending manner, incorporate and acknowledge that these groups exist and that you want to engage them in a meaningful manner? I think there are some signs that this is actually happening. I have no empirical evidence. Anecdotally, I see that happening, but I think that's going to have to change, because recognizing that it's not just through me and through my structure that change can happen, or that you can talk about issues or important social political challenges in Singapore. And the last thing is maybe acknowledging that a lot of the problems that we have are probably interconnected and require systemic change. And of course, it's going to be uncomfortable. When I talk about this, I talk about low-income labor, which I researched in, low-income family backgrounds, and we're also looking at things like discrimination and the extent to which systemic racism is a problem in Singapore. So confronting these issues that are difficult and might entail kind of uncomfortable conversations, but actually recognizing that needs to happen in a very non-condescending manner. And the final slide, I know about 5 minutes over, but in the final slide, by looking at the ground, for the ground itself, for use on the ground, I really think the role of the use of the ground is always to imagine and present ambitious visions. To me, if the use on the ground are not progressive or radical enough, then really, then it raises even bigger questions, because it is the role of use, I think, to imagine alternative futures and alternative visions that are constructive and productive. So that's the role of the ground, I think, to imagine these different futures. And because imagining futures that are more progressive and more radical, then it might seem a bit incongruent at this point in time, but those need to be explored. The second thing I would say also is, and this is kind of like a personal thing, and I want to make sure that I read this out because I don't want to paraphrase it, is to be cautious not to be seduced by the trappings of being at the table, to be co-opted as part of government task forces, conversation initiatives. Professor Mohan Dutta, who I interviewed on my podcast, frames it the best, and I think he encapsulates it the best. He says, how does the ground negotiate systems and navigate structures while trying to challenge and to bring about the narratives which change these systems and structures? What does that mean? It means for use on the ground, it means you have to still engage the government, right? It doesn't mean you have to throw yourself entirely into the government system, but having one foot into the government system in terms of having the active conversations is important, because yes, it's important to articulate the long-term vision and ambition, but how do we get there is an important question. And if you want to get there, the intermediate steps would have to involve state agencies and governments, and learning how to negotiate with the government is an important part of it. And I think that cannot go unspoken. And the last thing, a lot of things I levy against the government and government agencies, I think some of the ground groups are also guilty of in terms of representation by reach and diversity. I am pretty confident in terms of reach itself, both the government and the ground are not reaching the large middle or center. I use center and middle quite loosely. There's a large number of youths who are aware of issues, but they're not engaged to the extent of being involved in discussions and national conversations, right? So this is not just a problem for the government, this is also a problem for ground groups as well. How do you go beyond your traditional circles within which you are comfortable, and to reach out to a wider group of youth? That's going to be a challenge. And the same thing I said of the government just now, the same thing I'll say of ground organizations. The less ground organizations rely on faces like mine, Chinese, privileged, middle income, the better, because you want the diversity of perspectives from the ground who center their endeavors and initiatives very much on the community and not on translators like myself, because we can only do so much and we shouldn't take up space at the table. We should be learning how to use space to community members and groups that work on the ground that allow for these concerns to be articulated directly from the ground to the government in that sense.